It's been a real busy week for my wife and I. I had charge of an aunt who died this week, and I had another aunt that I didn't have charge of, but who died on the same day, about 2 or 3 hours apart. And so it's been a busy week. We tended to clean out my first aunt's apartment and make the arrangements for the funeral, and those of you who've been through this know. And then the funeral itself, and then we got home, and then immediately got in the car the next day and drove to southern Kentucky for another funeral. And so I was thinking about it. I didn't have to preach at any of those, which was good. But it was certainly a busy time. I think my hip has still not recovered from being in the car for 10 hours on Friday. But I was thinking about those things a great deal, and thought we might talk about it a little bit about this today. We're going to use Acts 8 in the first 2 verses as a sort of beginning point, which says, Saul was consenting unto his death, the death of Stephen. And at that time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem. They were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over it. And as I thought about this, I thought about that word great lamentation. Because really, that's the sort of thing we do at a funeral. But why? You stop to ask. I think a lot of people these days are sort of beginning to ask, why? What's the big deal? I've noticed that funerals seem to have fewer and fewer people attending. Why are we even going to have a funeral? Seems to be the question. These days things are so much more convenient. Surely we could just watch at home somehow on the internet. Or perhaps we could just mail it in. I have noticed that people don't seem to dress up in any respectful fashion, many of them, to attend funerals. It just looks as if, hey, I just came in from the dance club, or I just came in from my exercise class, and here I am for the funeral. So it's obvious there's a lot of people who are wondering, what's this all about? Nobody hardly. My wife fights the school bus every morning, and at least the people who want to drive by it at high speed. But a lot of people, nobody hardly pulls over to the side of the road as the hearse and the cortege pass. Anymore, we're too busy trying to get to wherever we're going. We don't hardly pay attention to this. And why go? You know, they said to us as we were making arrangements for the funeral, said, well, we can post her obituary online, on the website. And everybody can just post online comments. So you don't even have to go anymore. You don't even have to buy a card. You just post some online comments and be done with it and move on. We've sort of made it awfully convenient. You could just send a card. Funerals these days are held in really lovely funeral homes. It's convenient. Not anybody's private home, which is, when I grew up, there were a lot of funerals held in private homes. You had the casket in the living room. And people came in, visited, in the home. Everybody brought food to the home. And somebody would sit up with the body all night long. Usually the family would be so worn out they couldn't, so neighbors would come along and they would sit up with the body throughout the night. You don't have to, nobody does that anymore, do they? It's sort of gone by the wayside. So what's the big deal? Well, we preach about this. It's, I've preached at funerals. The body, it's just the body. It's not the person anymore. So what's the big deal? It's sort of like, get the impression from some people, it's kind of like taking out the trash. It's just the body. Why carry on over that? And it is just the body. The soul has moved on. So we say the soul's in heaven. And the struggle is over. And it is. In Revelation 14 and verse 13, I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Write, blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. So yes, it's just the body. The soul is in heaven, and the struggle of life is relieved and over, for which I suppose we're grateful. So what's the big deal? Why the great lamentation? Well, think with me a little bit about why the great lamentation. First of all, there's a sense of duty, responsibility. First of all, there's a duty to the body. In John 19 and verse 38, after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him leave. He came therefore and took the body of Jesus. And there came also Nicodemus, who at the first came to Jesus by night, and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. Then took they the body of Jesus and wound it in linen clothes with the spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein was never man yet laid. There laid they Jesus, therefore, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. They cared for the body. They cared for it. They could have just thrown him in the potter's field and been done with it. But they cared for the body. They took the time to prepare it for the burial. Expense. 100-pound weight of myrrh and aloes. See how much that costs you these days. Linen in that time was incredibly expensive. To wind the body, a new sepulchre where they could place the body. They cared about it. There was a duty they felt. And these men, who were not necessarily even relatives, one of whom, Joseph of Arimathea, had at one time been sort of secretive about his relationship with Jesus, now is realizing his responsibilities. You might also notice in Genesis, the 23rd chapter. Sarah was 107 and 20 years old. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Sarah died in Kirjatharba, the same as Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Why in the world do that? Abraham stood up from before his dead and spake unto the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me a possession of a burying place with you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. He had a duty to the body. But as well, there's a duty of reflection and grief. Usually we're aware of that. We have a duty to grieve. In Ecclesiastes 3, in the first 4 verses, to everything there is a season, a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. There's a time to mourn. It's a responsibility in life for those we love. We have a grief for our own sense of loneliness because we are alone now. And the family that we knew and loved has passed on. We have a grief for the struggle, because in each of our lives, there's been a struggle. You wives and husbands that have lost mates, your grief is about the struggle. You remember marrying, struggling to make a living, struggling to raise the kids, struggling to feed the family, struggling through difficulties in your marriage. And it's been a fight the whole way. And so there's, as you look back, there's a grief for the struggle. There's a grief for sins. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what do you think brought about this death? What do you think brought it about? Oh, yes, there was some disease. There was an accident. But why do you die? You do remember the 3rd chapter of Genesis, don't you? You do remember Hebrews, the 9th chapter. It's appointed unto man once to die. We die because of our sins. And there's a grief about that, because it's true of all of us. A misery and a grief in dying. You might notice with me while you're at it, Ecclesiastes, here I want you to notice the 7th chapter. I'll get it up here in a minute. Verse 2, it's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. You'll learn a whole lot more about life at a funeral home than you will ever learn at a big meal in a restaurant. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. You're going to learn a lot more about life, about its situation, about the struggle, about the difficulties, and about what sin has brought to pass in our lives. I want you to notice one other passage, this in Acts 9. I like this one. Verse 36. Now there was at Joppa a certain disciple named Tabitha, which by interpretation is called Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and alms deeds, which she did. She was a good woman. And it came to pass in those days that she was sick and died. whom, when they had washed, they laid her in an upper chamber. They cared for the body. You might notice that. They cared for the body. The ravages of death would have left some filth on the body. And so it was prepared and cleaned and laid out. And forasmuch as Lydda was nigh to Joppa, and the disciples had heard that Peter was there, they sent unto him 2 men, desiring him that he would not delay to come to them. The Jews had the habit of burying very quickly. We wait a few more days because of our embalming practices. But the Jews usually buried in 24 hours. Then Peter arose and went with them. When he was come, they brought him to the upper chamber. And all the widows stood by him weeping and showing the coats and garments which Dorcas made while she was with them. Why did they do that? Because there was a duty to reflect on the life of this woman and the good things she had done for them in life. There was a duty to remember that. You don't just throw the body out the door. There's a duty to remember the good there, the wonderful things there. Yes, we know there was a struggle in life. Sometimes it was hard. But this person had love and kindness and goodness in their heart. And it's important to remember that. Not just to close the door and, tomorrow's another day. But in addition, we have a responsibility to honor the nobility of family. Family. That thing that God, that institution that God created first in our lives. The family. In 1 Timothy, the 5th chapter, in verse 2, he says that you should treat the elder women as mothers, the younger as sisters, with all purity. Honor widows that are widows indeed. But if any widow have children or nephews, let them learn first to show piety at home and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. And then in verse 16, if any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. Who's going to care for your family? This extends out to nephews and other relatives. We've got someone who has died. Who's going to see to this family? This is something for the family to gather around and care for and see to. In 2 Samuel, the 3rd chapter, verse 31, David said to Joab and to all the people that were with him, rend your clothes, gird you with sackcloth, and mourn before Abner. Abner had been killed by Joab. King David himself followed the bier, and they buried Abner in Hebron. And the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king lamented over Abner and said, died Abner as a fool dieth. Thy hands were not bound, nor thy feet put into fetters. As a man falleth before wicked men, so fellest thou. And all the people wept again over him. And when all the people came to cause David to eat meat, while it was yet day, David sware, saying, so do God to me, and more also, if I taste bread, or aught else, till the sun be down. And all the people took notice of it, and it pleased them, as whatsoever the king did pleased all the people. For all the people and all Israel understood that day that it was not of the king to slay Abner the son of Ner, And the king said unto his servants, Know you not that there is a prince and a great man fallen this day in Israel? It's important to remember that. Your family member fell. Your friend, your brother. And it's important to remember. It's not a day to have a party. It's not a day to rejoice. It's a day to remember that a prince and a great man, a great woman, has fallen this day in Israel. In 2 Samuel, again, this was the passage I suggested Tim read. So I'll read it with you. You can read with me. So, one of the things I want you to notice, both of the men in both these passages, David was fighting against Abner. Do you realize that? Abner had been the general of the opposing army. He had been the general. He had made peace, but Joab was a little jealous. So he wasn't a relative, but David treated him with respect and honor. There was a duty to realize the nobility of the man. And this next passage in 2 Samuel 1 is Saul. Saul had been trying to kill David for years out of jealousy. David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. He bade them teach the children of Judah the use of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. Ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew, neither let there be rain upon you, nor fields of offerings, for there the shield of the mighty is vilely cast away. The shield of Saul, as though he had not been anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan, turn not back, and the sword of Saul return not empty. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothes you in scarlet, with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high places. I am distressed for me, my brother. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished? Honoring the nobility of your family and other people's family. I want you to look at one passage. We've studied it on Wednesday night recently. It's in 1 Peter 2 in verse 17. And think about it just a minute. The first passage is just, the first of the passage is just 3 words. It's honor all men. I've been thinking about that passage lately. You know, we all drive around and we see some fellow that looks like a derelict. Clothes are dirty. Begging maybe for money. And it's real easy to be turned off. But do you realize this passage says that I should treat that man with as much honor as I treat the President of the United States? Honor all men. We see someone who's a terrible sinner, a prostitute, a harlot. This passage applies to her. We see someone who's a drunkard. This passage applies to them. We see someone who's a terrible sinner. He's beat his wife. He's an adulterer. This passage applies to them. Honor all men. There's a duty of respect. The next part of the passage says, love the brotherhood. You know, our tight little group, there's people we know. But every now and then we hear of the death of someone far off who's a Christian. That should bother us. We should grieve. There's a reminder in a funeral that we do not live alone. I want to tell people that. And so when I hear of my relative who has died a long way from me, this second aunt that died, I haven't seen in years. As I mentioned, she lived in southern Kentucky, had 2 daughters, wife of my uncle, my dad's brother. But as I thought about it, I thought about going because I was tired, my wife was tired. I thought, I need to let them know that they're still family. That we're not alone. And that if they need anything, the family's still there. We need to remind one another, the people who are left, we're not alone. Look in Romans 14 in verse 7. It says, none of us liveth to himself, and no man dieth to himself. Whether we live unto the Lord, and whether we die unto the Lord. Whether we live therefore or die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ both died and rose and revived, that he might be Lord both of the dead and of the living. Why dost thou judge thy brother? Or why dost thou set at naught thy brother? For if we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. As it is written, as I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then every one of us shall give account of himself to God. I want my family and my friends, my brethren, insofar as I'm able, to know that they are not alone. In Hebrews 12, excuse me, I get fussed at for not sticking these up. Ye are come unto Mount Zion and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels. And so I believe that in the hospital room, in hospice, as we traveled south, someone died in an automobile accident, in a fire. I believe the angels were in all those places. He says we are come to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, which are written in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect. We are not alone. And I want my friends and family to know that at this time. You're not alone anymore. You never were. I was always there. All you had to do was call on me. In Ecclesiastes 4, in verse 8, it says, there is one alone, and there is not a second. Let me just say, young people, that the Lord wants you to marry. These days, people have got to where a lot of people have gotten to where they look down on marriage. We've made such a travesty of marriage. We've ridiculed it with homosexual marriage. We've ridiculed it with constant divorces, adulteries. We ridicule marriage. But God doesn't intend, never intended for you to, and I think a lot of people are afraid of marriage now. God doesn't intend for you to be alone. And so There is one alone, there is not a second. Yea, he hath neither child nor brother, yet is there no end of all his labor. Neither is his eye satisfied with riches. Here this old bachelor is. He's wealthy, he's got money, but his eye isn't satisfied with riches. Neither saith he, for whom do I labor? And bereave my soul of good. What am I killing myself for? This is also vanity, a sore travail. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth. Boy, I tell you, I've begun to know what that means. Haven't you, Rita? Rita fell the other day, and she had to call the ambulance and say, I've fallen and I can't get up. I'm beginning to get there myself. If I fall, I may have to drag myself over to a chair somewhere and get myself up that way. If they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. Woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. If two lie together, they have heat. How can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him. And a threefold cord is not quickly broken. You should get married. You should have children. You know, my mother, this morning, she didn't know about this sermon. She was just telling me, because we were fussing about one of my maiden aunts. She said she should have married. She should have had her own children. She told a story about an old lady back in her childhood. She said up in North Alabama, when she was 7 years old, she went to visit. And the young girl there was saying, well, I'm not going to get married. I'm happy the way I am. And the old woman said, who's going to take care of you when you're old? And that's a good question. When you need help, will there be anyone to help? We need to remember we do not live alone. There may be folks we have to help. Let's look at a passage in Psalms. Sing unto God, sing praises to his name. Extol him that rideth on the heavens by his name, Yahweh, and rejoice before him. A father of the fatherless and a judge of the widows is God in his holy place. God setteth the solitary in families. He bringeth out those that are bound with chains. He setteth the solitary in families. Now, if you have widows, if you have that old bachelor, if you have that old maid in your family, they're in your family and you're responsible. We need to let them know you're not alone. You're part of the family. One last passage this morning in James 1 and verse 27. Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. The fatherless and widows. Who are those people? They're the people who need to know the most that they are not alone. They're not alone. And so, as you go to that funeral, and you look at that widow, and you look at those children who have no father anymore, remember why you're there. You're there to let them know they're not alone. You're here to be a help to them. Well, let's remember that first passage. Devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation. Why does it call them devout men? Do you remember the verse just before this? It says because of the persecution, the church was scattered abroad. But there were a few faithful men of courage left who took care of Stephen and his body and his burial. The Lord died for us alone. And we owe our salvation to him for it. We've come here, if you will, as attendees at his funeral. We're going to eat his body and drink his blood in just a minute to remember that sacrifice. I pray that you can partake of it. I pray that you can benefit from it. If you're not a Christian, you need to come. You're not alone. You're not dishonored. The Lord will forgive you, and we will honor you just as we would honor the greatest. Come while we stand and sing.